The queen was not in her palace. She was somewhere near Egypt's eastern edge, pushed toward the desert, cut off from the city that was supposed to obey her name. Alexandria still glittered behind her in the distance. Its lighthouse still watched the sea. Its libraries, temples, docks, and marble halls still belonged to the kingdom her family had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. But in 48 BCE, Cleopatra VII was no longer safely inside that world. Her younger brother sat on the throne beside advisors who had turned the court against her. Her army had been checked near Pelusium. Her claim was hanging by a thread. She had been born royal. Now she was an exile. How did a young queen, driven from her own capital, become the last great ruler of Egypt and one of the most remembered names in history? Every legend was once unknown. This is the story of what came before Cleopatra. Before the myths, before the paintings, before Rome turned her into a warning, Cleopatra was a teenager inside a dying dynasty. She was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic house, a Macedonian Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the age of Alexander the Great. Her ancestor, Ptolemy I, had been one of Alexander's generals. After Alexander's empire broke apart, Ptolemy took Egypt and built a kingdom whose capital, Alexandria, became one of the great intellectual and commercial centers of the ancient world. But by Cleopatra's lifetime, the glory was fragile. The Ptolemies had wealth. They had ceremony. They had old titles, golden crowns, and temples along the Nile. But they also had debt, violence, family rivalry, and a growing dependence on Rome. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Elites, ruled because Rome allowed him to rule. His nickname meant the flute player, and ancient writers did not describe him as a strong king. He spent heavily, courted powerful Romans, and struggled to hold the loyalty of his own people. When Cleopatra was still young, her father was forced from Egypt. He went abroad seeking Roman help, while his daughter Berenice took power in Alexandria. The lesson was brutal and simple. A crown could vanish. A sibling could become an enemy. And Egypt, however ancient, could not ignore Rome. What kind of child grows up inside that kind of palace? Cleopatra was not raised in a peaceful royal household. She was raised in a court where survival required language, performance, calculation, and speed. Ancient accounts say she was educated, eloquent, and unusually gifted with languages. Unlike many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, she appears to have embraced Egyptian culture and presented herself not merely as a Greek queen ruling Egypt, but as an Egyptian ruler before Egyptians. That mattered. In Alexandria, Greek learning and Egyptian tradition lived beside one another, sometimes uneasily. A queen who could move between those worlds had an advantage no ceremonial crown could give. Still, intelligence did not make her safe. In 51 BCE, Ptolemy XII died. Cleopatra, about 18 years old, inherited the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Joint rule was normal in the dynasty. So was marriage between royal siblings. But normal did not mean stable. Cleopatra soon acted like the senior ruler. Her name appeared with power. Her decisions came quickly. She did not seem willing to disappear behind a boy king and the men who controlled him. That was dangerous. The advisors around Ptolemy XIII had every reason to fear her. A young queen with a mind of her own threatened their access to the throne. If she ruled alone, they became smaller. If her brother ruled through them, they became Egypt's real power. So the struggle sharpened. By 49 BCE, Cleopatra had been pushed from power. She fled, gathered supporters, and raised forces outside Egypt, near Syria and the eastern border. The queen who would later be remembered as irresistible was, at that moment, a claimant without a capital. This was the humiliation beneath the legend. No empire of romance. No golden barge. No timeless icon staring from marble. Only a young woman from a collapsing dynasty, trying to return to a throne that her own family had taken from her. And then Rome arrived. In 48 BCE, the Roman Civil War spilled into Egypt. Julius Caesar had defeated Pompey the Great at Pharsalus. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for refuge. Instead, he was murdered by men connected to Ptolemy XII's court, who believed they were pleasing Caesar by presenting him with the head of his rival. They misjudged him. Caesar entered Alexandria and found Egypt divided between two royal siblings. Ptolemy's advisors expected to manage the situation. Cleopatra understood that the real decision now rested with a Roman general who needed money, stability, and legitimacy in one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean. But how could an exiled queen reach him? The famous story says Cleopatra was smuggled into Caesar's quarters, hidden inside bedding or a sack. Later retellings turned it into a carpet, though the details differ in ancient sources. What matters is not the prop. What matters is the risk. If she was discovered, she could have been killed. If Caesar refused her, she could have been handed back to her brother. If she did nothing, she might disappear from history before her story truly began. So Cleopatra chose the dangerous door. She entered Alexandria in secret and placed herself before Caesar. Not as a myth. As a politician with no safe option left. The meeting changed everything. Caesar backed a settlement that restored Cleopatra to power alongside Ptolemy XIII, but the court did not accept it quietly. War broke out in Alexandria. Caesar, outnumbered at first, was trapped in a city full of enemies. The palace quarter became a battlefield. The harbor burned. Armies moved through streets built for trade and scholarship, not Roman siege warfare. Cleopatra's fate was tied to Caesar's survival. If he fell, she fell. If her brother won, her exile would become permanent, or worse. Then reinforcements came. In 47 BCE, Ptolemy XIII fled after defeat and drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra, still young, emerged from the civil war not as a discarded sister, but as queen. She ruled with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, in the formal language of dynasty. But the center of power had shifted. The exile had returned. That same year, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, known to Egyptians as Caesarion. Caesar was widely believed to be the father, though Roman politics would never allow that fact to be simple. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was more than a child. He was a bridge between Egypt and Rome. He was a possible future. He was a living claim that her dynasty could still matter in a world increasingly ruled by Roman power. But Rome was never a safe ally. Cleopatra later traveled to Rome and stayed there while Caesar stood at the height of his authority. To Roman elites, her presence was unsettling. She was a foreign queen, a monarch in a republic already afraid that Caesar wanted kingship. Then, on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. Again, the ground vanished beneath her. What was Cleopatra without Caesar? She returned to Egypt. Ptolemy XIV died soon after, under circumstances ancient sources do not allow historians to prove with certainty. Cleopatra made Caesarion her co-ruler as Ptolemy XV. She ruled through crisis, bad harvests, Roman instability, and the constant danger that Egypt would become merely another prize in Rome's internal wars. The years that followed showed the real shape of her power. Cleopatra was not simply surviving through famous men. She was using every alliance available to keep Egypt independent. She controlled a wealthy kingdom in a world where wealth drew Roman attention like flame draws night insects. Grain, ships, taxes, ports, and prestige made Egypt too valuable to ignore. Then came Mark Antony. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus to answer questions about her loyalty after Caesar's murder. She arrived not as a frightened dependent, but as a queen staging power with precision. Ancient writers describe the meeting in theatrical language, with Cleopatra presenting herself in divine splendor. The account may be colored by Roman imagination, but the political result was clear. Antony needed Egypt. Cleopatra needed protection. Their alliance became personal, military, and dynastic. It gave Cleopatra territory, influence, and the possibility of restoring parts of the old Ptolemaic sphere. In 34 BCE, at the donations of Alexandria, Antony publicly distributed eastern territories among Cleopatra's children and recognized Caesarion as Caesar's son. To Cleopatra, this may have looked like the revival of a kingdom. To Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir in Rome, it was a weapon. He turned Antony and Cleopatra into a threat to Roman identity. The propaganda was devastating. Antony was portrayed as enslaved by an Eastern queen. Cleopatra became the foreign seductress, the dangerous woman, the enemy who had corrupted a Roman man. It was not just politics. It was character assassination at the scale of history. In 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's forces at Actium. The campaign ended in disaster. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria. Antony followed. The alliance that had promised to save Egypt now drew Rome directly to its gates. In 30 BCE, Octavian entered Egypt. Antony died by suicide after hearing a false report that Cleopatra was already dead. Cleopatra met Octavian and tried, as she had tried all her life, to negotiate from the edge of catastrophe. But this time the door did not open. She could not save Egypt. She could not save Caesarion. She could not save the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ancient writers say Cleopatra died by suicide, and the most famous version claims an asp was involved, though the exact method remains uncertain. She was 39 years old. Egypt was annexed by Rome. Caesarion was killed soon afterward. Her surviving children with Antony were taken into the Roman world. That was the price. The woman who fought to preserve Egypt became the symbol Rome used to explain why Egypt had to be conquered. The queen who spoke many languages was reduced for centuries to a story about beauty. The ruler who negotiated with Caesar, Antony, and Octavian was remembered too often as a temptation instead of a strategist. But beneath the myth, another Cleopatra remains. A young exile who refused to vanish. A monarch born into a broken dynasty who learned that power depended not only on blood, but on timing, language, courage, and the willingness to risk everything when every safe path had closed. The night she came back to Alexandria, she was not yet a legend. She was a displaced queen with enemies in her own palace and Rome waiting outside the door. But she stepped through that door anyway, and the world never stopped speaking her name. The queen was not in her palace at the beginning of the story, but history would never remove her from it again, because every legend was once unknown.